Thank you, Austin. Good evening. So, the story I'm going to tell you tonight stands a little bit in stark contrast to current events today. This activity remained classified by the U.S. government until 2013. Issue. And Russia also classified it for about 40 years. So let me get started. The name of this is the Project Zebra, which was actually the name of this effort. And it was the hosting by the U.S. Navy of approximately 150 Soviet airmen in the United States. So this program was under the auspices of the Lend-Lease program, which you all may have read about in your history books. The Lend-Lease Act was passed in March of 1941, and it started to provide more material to our allies during the war. It primarily started with England, but it spread to other countries, and when Russia was invaded in August of 1942, we started shipping all kinds of equipment to them. Russia received, over the course of the war, $11 billion in 1944 dollars, or approximately $250 billion today. And it's in the same price range that, we're supporting people today in Ukraine. It included 15,000 aircraft. Stalin expressed specifically a need to President Roosevelt that he needed modern American seaplanes to help protect the shipping convoys to Russia. And the convoy that kind of woke everybody up was a convoy called BQ-17, and there are books written about it. It was a disaster. In June, July of 1942, they lost 23 of 35 ships to German surface, U-boat, and aircraft as the convoy tried to reach Murmansk. It was a loss of 3,350 vehicles and over 99,000 tons of war material in that one convoy. So, in April of 1944, the Soviets brought over through Iceland 26 Soviet Navy aircrews, and each aircrew had 5 men. Elizabeth City, North Carolina, was chosen for the following reasons. It was a fully equipped U.S. Navy air base with access to a large sheltered tributary, the Pasquotank River, and good runways, and a Coast Guard maintenance facility. It was only 40 miles from the U.S. Navy command and support at Norfolk, and it was only 254 miles from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, and we'll get into that in a bit. The town is also isolated geographically by the Great Dismal Swamp. And it's so, it wasn't on the main drag, if you will. It was out of the way. So this was, the classic case of hiding something in plain sight. Training immediately began to familiarize the crews with the systems on the PBN aircraft. Now, let me talk a little bit about the letters in front of the airplane. The Navy assigned the first 2 letters to the role of the aircraft. So PB stood for Patrol Bomb. The next letter was a letter assigned to the manufacturer. So you often find the Catalinas as a PBY. Well, Y was the designation for the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation. However, these were not made by Consolidated. They were made under license or by the Navy. And we'll get into that further later on. But the crews that came over, the Soviet seaplane designs were bluntly archaic. They were single-engine, slow aircraft. So they had to learn how to fly and operate, maintain multi-engine aircraft that had modern navigation systems and now for the first time radar. This is an aerial view of the region where Elizabeth City is. The town is over here. And the town today has not been redeveloped. So I know I was going to trip on these wires. So when you drive in there, and drive around the town, it's like you were there back in the 1940s. It's the old architecture. It hasn't changed. And then a few miles away is the Navy and Coast Guard airfield. This airfield still is up and running today. The Coast Guard has got a very active maintenance facility here. And on the other side of the runway over here is the civilian side, and civilian pilots can use the airport. I have flown in there. Oh. And of course, the Pasquotank River was, of course, the runway for the seaplanes. This is a close-up of the airbase, and the shoreline has changed since the war. The original ramp is here. This shoreline has receded back over time, but you could still see vestiges of the original seaplane launch ramp there. So my dad his background is this. He was born in 1922 in Wiesbaden, Germany. His parents were Russian expatriates. He grew up speaking only French and Russian in the house. He knew no English. His parents had settled in France, Paris, after they had fled from Russia after the Russian Revolution. My grandfather immigrated to the U.S. to Ellis Island in 1926, and young Gregory joined his parents in 1935. He was 13 at the time. Knew no English, went straight into high school and learned English off a fly. And when he graduated, he went to St. Paul's High School in New York. When he graduated, he was accepted into electrical engineering at MIT in the fall of 1939, which of course is when World War II began. When the U.S. got into the war in December of 1941, all of the college curriculums were accelerated throughout the country. There was no more summer vacation. You kept going through the summer. And so he finished early and graduated in February of 1943. And at that point, you were basically you had to sign up for one of the services. So he had already enrolled in Navy ROTC and got his commission while he was in school. They didn't wait back then. And so he graduated. He was already an ensign. He began immediately his training, which went on for about 9 months, and I've listed it there. Naval Training School, radar at Harvard, and then the radiation lab at MIT, and then advanced radar training for airborne radar application in the Naval Base in Corpus Christi, Texas. Then he was assigned to Patrol Squadron VPB 18, based out of Charleston, South Carolina, and they began to drill intensively to prepare for deployment to the Pacific. Then, just as the squadron was due to deploy in May of 1944, his commanding officer gets a phone call. And I'm going to play a video now. And I'm going to let you hear my dad talk about what happened. Let me see here. I've got to fish it out.
What?
Give me a moment. It's not going to let me minimize this.
But
2 weeks before shipping out to the Pacific, and we had the feeling that's where we were heading, I get orders, much to the disgust of the commanding officer, who just, you know, I was his communications officer besides being radar. I mean, all the dispatches and everything came through me. And now I'm gone. So he tried to keep me, but no luck. So I get orders. You are to report to Commander Atlantic Fleet, Norfolk, Virginia, for further orders. And Norfolk base is just like finding yourself in the middle of a huge city. It took me 3 days of going from one office to another until finally I was told by a chief petty officer, Mr. Gagarin, you take your stuff and go downtown and catch a bus to Elizabeth City, North Carolina, 40 miles south of here. Go to the Coast Guard base and report there. You'll find out when you report to the Navy detachment of the Coast Guard base what to do. So I went, took the bus, got a cab, 7 miles to the base, and as the cab drove in, this is where I saw a PBY with red stars on it. And I said, aha, now I know what I'm going to do. The chief petty officer was an interesting guy, Chief Krivitsky. And he had a lot of stripes. He'd been in the Navy, and he came from Russia as an emigre in the 20s. And he ended up at Ellis Island. I asked him about his back. And he remembered some Russian, but not much. There was another guy by the name of Kostritsky. Actually, there were about 3 of us who spoke fairly decent Russian. And one interesting thing, at that time there was a seaman, a U.S. Navy seaman, who came straight from the Indian reservation somewhere in the Carolinas into the Navy. And he was looking at all this and Lend-Lease. He says, what's all this Lend-Lease? He says, we're giving these planes to these Russians and so on. why don't we have Lend-Lease on the reservation? Yes, I really admire that guy. He had a great common sense. He was a good mechanic, but unfortunately he never got the education. I don't know what happened to him or what he's doing, but I always remember that young Indian seaman as being so intelligent. This model doesn't show it, but it had antennas, radio antennas, running from almost the wingtip towards the tail, almost on both sides, so long antennas. And after about 4 sets of flights, we got word that these antennas were breaking. And they would come to Canada, to Gander, Newfoundland, with no radio. At that time, the airport at Gander was rather busy because that's when most of the B-17s were being flown from the States to Europe against Germany. And there was a B-17 leaving the plane, going across the Atlantic every minute. So they couldn't just hold all traffic around Gander while they landed a disabled Soviet plane. So, but nobody could tell me why. I mean, we looked at the antennas, we did all we could to find out the problem. Finally, I said, well, let me go up there. So I did fly with one of the flights from Elizabeth City to Gander. On the way, I took my time to really teach the radio guy all about the electronic system he's got. He knew most of it, but he was very weak, especially in direction finding. I kept plotting a course by triangulating on stations in New York, Boston, and somewhere in Maine. I could triangulate and plot exactly where we were and how we were proceeding. And I was showing him how to do that. And we were going at an angle about 3 degrees off course towards Gander. So I mentioned to him, said, why don't you tell the pilot, says that we're flying slightly off course, just notch the thing over by 3 degrees to the west here. The answer sort of went from our captain to the lead plane captain, who waited, came back and said, how do you know we're flying off course? Well, Gagarin's back here plotting the course, and he's telling me, silence. We'll stay on course, as I tell you. Typical Soviet, no, I'm right. So eventually we fly. I didn't worry. I knew where I was. I could tell them eventually, especially after training those guys on PBMs flying out of Rio de Janeiro, you know. If I could find them Charleston for them, I can find Gander for this guy. And finally we fly over, there's a bunch of islands, and those are those French islands off the coast of Canada, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. And then when you saw those islands, you realized where you was. Turned west to Gander. But then coming back to the antenna problem, actually the Canadians was the guys who helped me out the most, because what happened at the Naval Aircraft Factory, there was copper wire, and they soldered the antenna to grommets. And this thing, as it flies, sets up mechanical waves. And as it flops, at the end of the wire, it goes like this all the time, and it would break right at the grommet, and that's it, no antenna. Well, what happened was the aircraft factory did 2 things wrong. One, they soldered this thing, which damaged the physical nature of the copper wire, made it weaker by heating and cooling. And secondly, it was badly corroded by the high corrosion atmosphere of the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia. So finally we told the aircraft factory, says, look, from now on, send us these planes without the antennas. Just give me one short antenna for radio contact, and that's all. And we'll put them on in here, or else you fellas splice them. And they did that. For the next 100 planes, we had no problems. So it's things of this nature that came up. There were two commanding officers. The first one, unfortunately, never made it back to Russia. He was the only plane we lost en route off the coast of Norway, and on that first bunch. Actually, it was him and another pilot on another plane flying more or less together, and the other pilot reported very dense fog and terrible weather, and they had radio silence. They had to have radio silence because the Germans were just waiting to hear that off the coast of Norway. But he did break radio silence to try to find this man, and he just disappeared. After the war, I know they've been searching both Luftwaffe records, Norwegian records, and there's nothing about anybody shooting down that plane. The one plane that came through did report that they had terrible weather, storms and so on. And it may well be that they just crashed. Went in lower and lower and lower in the water, and then went too low and went in. So that was the only one we lost on takeoff. I should say lost en route.
All right, so moving on. Dad kind of already started talking to you about the Russian personnel. I'm going to give you a little more of an introduction. The first guy that is on the left there is Lieutenant Colonel Vasiliev, who was the commanding officer of the entire Zebra unit, flew the trailing plane on that first formation of aircraft that flew to Murmansk, and he was lost. There's more to this story later. But then he was replaced by the next guy over, and this is Lieutenant Colonel Maxim Chibisov. And Dad became close friends with him. The next gentleman is Major Sadnikov, and Major Sadnikov was probably the most competent guy they had for electrical and electronics. And he and my dad spent a lot of time together. One of the jobs they had to do was translate all of the maintenance manuals and all the operation manuals for the aircraft from English into Russian. It must have been a huge job. I'm sure what the process was is my dad sat there, the two of them together, and began translating. My dad would write it out in Russian in longhand, give the piece of paper to a Soviet staff member, and he would start typing it up on a Soviet typewriter in Cyrillic. And then, it must have been a very laborious process. The next gentleman is Lieutenant Colonel Turtsev, who was a technical expert. We are somewhat guessing he might have been also one of the resident KGB guys. The only reason I'd say that is because he really didn't have a job, and he was the same rank as the commanding officer. The next gentleman after that is Major Shapkin, who was, and this is a Russian role, flagship specialist. I'm not sure what it means, but that's what his title is. And then finally, an engineer, Major Trainov. Yeah. All right, the U.S. Navy. The head of the entire project was Vice Admiral Bellinger. And he had cut his teeth on seaplanes as a young naval officer, had also been commander of the Langley aircraft carrier. He was in charge of the entire show. The next gentleman is Commander George Owen. And he was also in Norfolk, but he was the commanding officer for the project. And then the next gentleman is Commander Stanley Chernak, and that was Dad's boss. And Dad became very close with him. And then finally, my dad was there, is one of the, the only naval officer that had one electrical engineering degree and spoke Russian as a native language. And that's why he got pulled out of the squadron from Charleston. The other U.S. Navy staff, you already heard about Chief Krivitsky, expat Ukrainian. He was also very good at finding things. And you always have someone on the base that's very good at finding things that can't be found. And you don't ask them where they come from. Then you have Lieutenant Stowers, who was the instructor for aircraft maintenance. And then your instructor pilots, Hodge and Gilchrist. And finally, Lieutenant Junior Grade Kalick, electrical systems, and also a translator. You saw this picture a moment ago. This is what I call the class photo. You have Admiral Bellinger here, and the U.S. Navy guys in white. All the Russians are in dark. And one of the things, those guys wore the Soviet wool uniforms in the summertime in North Carolina. They must have died. My dad's over here. One of the things that was unique about the Catalina for the Soviets is that it had this birdcage gun station, fully enclosed. Up to that point, all the Catalinas had a semi-open good station. This one was fully enclosed, and obviously in the Soviet climate, you'd want to have that protection. This is just to give you some specifications of the airplane. The wingspan's 104 feet, which really is not that different from a B-17. It's about the same. Tail height was 17 feet 11 inches. It carried 3 50 caliber machine guns, and one here in the nose and one each in the 2 waist blisters. Also carrying a 4th machine gun, 30 caliber, and a man could lay on his belly down here and put the machine gun out here under the tail, so that if somebody's coming up behind them, they could hit it with that. The fuel tank capacity on these Catalinas was enlarged. Some of them were self-sealing. You had a capacity of 2,085 gallons. That's a lot of fuel. You had 2 radial R1830 engines at 1,200 horsepower each. The range was 3,700 miles, at 111 miles an hour. So it isn't fast, but it can patrol for a very long time. And that range is going to come in needed when we talk about how the planes got to Russia. This is this is about the best photograph I have of the PBN. Again, the bulbous birdcage, gun position here. The wings are reinforced, heavier armament, and you can see here, protruding from this porthole is the radar antenna. Later in the production models, I think they actually have it mounted this way, each side. This is to give you an idea on the interior. You had a bay here with bunks, which could be folded up and out of the way if you needed the rope. You also had a galley that could make hot meals, in which you would meet on long patrols. You could be up for as long as 36 hours. This little motor here is actually an auxiliary power unit. And if the plane is parked someplace, they can run that to run the electrical power of the plane. This is where the planes were made. This is the U.S. Naval Shipyard in 1941 in Philadelphia. It's this very little building here and these adjacent buildings here. And this facility was established in 1918 by the Navy for the purpose of building trainers and seaplanes because, one, the Navy wanted to keep their hand in the manufacturing technology, and they wanted to see what else they could develop. So they set up their own airplane manufacturing facility. This is the Naval Shipyard today. It's still there. Here's the building. You could drive into the shipyard today because the shipyard is no longer an entire military installation. But if you drive by this building, don't stop and don't take pictures. If you do, you're going to have a close and friendly conversation with the U.S. Navy police. And I speak from personal experience. This building is still used by the Navy for surface warfare weapons research. It's very sensitive, and they don't want people getting out of their car and gawking. You can drive by there, but don't hang around. So to me, it's cool that it's still there. They did have socializing. Here we have Soviet American officers doing a game of backgammon and just relaxing in the evening. I don't know if the Soviets ever took the uniform off. This is just another picture of Soviet American officers conferring. And this is like one of my favorite pictures. We have a group shot here of Lieutenant Colonel Chibisov, commander, my dad, Sapkin, Tartsiev, Sadnikov is here, and Blinken's here. So these guys spent a lot of time together. This was taken at the Wright Brothers Flight Memorial marker. The Soviets were very interested in the Wright Brothers Memorial Monument. And they made a number of trips to go see the museum and where flight was begun, was born. And here we have, these are some high-ranking guys. We've got Lieutenant Colonel Chippesoff here, U.S. Navy Commander Chuniak, Colonel Mazurk, Lieutenant Colonel Daniloff, and Lieutenant Colonel Porolenko, who was the USSR Naval Attaché. And that marker's there today. You can go stand in front of it, get you a picture taken there. So the first delivery of aircraft was from Elizabeth City to Remax, and my dad has already told you a little bit about that effort. The route was from Elizabeth City to Gander, Newfoundland, to Reykjavik, Iceland, and then on to Murmansk. The distance was 4,500 miles, and at 115 miles an hour, the flight time was 45 hours. Now, obviously, they didn't do this nonstop. They first went to Gander, where you heard about the radio antenna problems. They also had weather moving in all the time. And in the midst of all of this, the B-17s are taking off 1 a minute around the clock. Initial group was 25 aircraft. The crew, in addition to the 2 Russian pilots, navigator, and flight support, included also a RAF pilot, a navigator, and a flight engineer. And here's the way this worked. When the planes left the United States, the Russians didn't fly them. The RAF did. They had an entire corps of overseas flight specialist pilots that had done transatlantic flights hundreds of times. So these guys were tapped to fly the planes to Iceland. When it got to Iceland, the British crew gets off, and the Soviet air crews take over. They sign title to the aircraft, and now it's theirs. And they head to Russia. And that process throughout the entire delivery was how that worked. Always an RAF crew leaving the United States. Soviets never flew out of the United States. And they changed hands and were. So they ran into trouble. The there was 25 EBN Catalinas, and the formation departed Newfoundland on 6/14, and then Iceland on 6/18/44. As the formation approached Norway, they had low visibility and very high winds, and this detail is now coming from Chibisov's logs and flight notes and reports. That information was not available at the time my dad did that interview. They were forced to fly down, the aircraft were forced to fly and descend and fly a few hundred feet off the water. The winds were so rough, they couldn't put on the automatic pilot. So they all made it except one. As you heard, 2 aircraft became separated from the others, including the aircraft of Lieutenant Colonel Vasiliev. And as they were flying, they did not know where they were relative to the Norwegian coast. And there's mountains. So it's really not a good situation. Low ceiling, low visibility, high winds, and you're groping. So in 6/19, the Vasiliev's plane loses its way, and they find it in 2007. It's found by the Norway Reconnaissance Regiment. And they just happened to be out there one day, and they come across the wreckage. Remains of the crew were still there. The Germans did find the wreck, and they kind of cleaned out the wreck of things they wanted, documents and whatever, but they left the bodies there and parts of the plane. So there is a memorial marker there today, but this is where the plane hit. And as you can see, here's Russia. Was close. He just lost his way and didn't stay clear of the cliffs. It mixed. So when they lost their commander, they had to get a new commander, and Lieutenant Colonel Maxim Chibisov was tapped, and he arrived on August 15th, 1944, to take command. Chibisov immediately departed for Kodiak, Alaska, because that's the direction they're going to go in the next time. The Russians do not want to try Murmansk again. Now, the reason they're going to go up through Alaska, across the Bering Straits into Russia, was we had already delivered hundreds of American fighters through that route, and it was thought, let's do this with the Catalinas as well. So the new route was to Olympus City, Kodiak, Alaska, which is on the Bering Straits. I'll show you later where these places are, but they're in the middle of nowhere. And then down the coast, south along the Russian coast of Alabastar. Now, this group had some challenges besides what I want to get to here in a minute. The Russians were not allowed to fly across the United States. Stalin had prohibited any foreign Allied crews from flying that were flying Russian airspace. So we said, okay, you're not flying across the U.S. So the Russian air crews were flown up to Kodiak by U.S. Navy transport as passengers, and the Catalinas were flown by U.S. Navy crews, actually all the way down through Texas, and then up the coast into Alaska. But when they got there, they ran into, the weather in Alaska. Now, this is summertime, but even so, they had continuous storms, marginal visibility, mountain ranges, and when they got to Adnar in Russia, there was non-existent facilities. There's no navigation maps, and there's no radio communications. They had to call back to Kodiak to talk to somebody. It was over 6,500 miles. But they did get the consignment of PBMs that they wanted to deliver by 9/12 to the USSR Pacific Fleet. And they had to get it done by then because after that, winter was coming in that part of the world. And they flying in Kodiak Bay would start to freeze up. You can't land airplanes on ice floes. So by this time, the Soviets have already received a large number of aircraft, and they begin to use them. Here are some of the accounts that have been captured. They have rescued a combat crew of an Illusion 2, which had become stranded in Norway. Norway, if you remember, was still occupied by the Germans. In July 44, there was continuous sea patrols in the Barents and Kara Seas to clear out the U-boat presence. And that's the area right outside of Murmansk and Archangel. And that's where the Germans had really been sinking all the ships. Once these planes came with the radar, they could see the sub from miles away. and they could come and hit those subs on the surface, they didn't have a chance. The Soviets thought up of a new role for the Catalina. They're starting to use them as a commando transport. So on 8/29/44, the Catalina's glided in, dead stick landing on the Black Sea, right off of the Bulgarian port of Constanta, and charged into the port and just routed the troops. They had no idea what hit them. They also did search and rescue missions of downed aircraft in the Barents Sea, commando missions in Denmark, and finally transport and search and rescue when the Soviets finally did declare war on Japan in August of 45. In fact, they did that the night we dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And then they invaded the Kuril and Sakhalin Islands. Or Sakhalin Island, the Kuril Peninsula. So, it was wintertime now, no more flying to Alaska. So they had to come up with another route, and this route was really a long way. And I'm going to shift, if I can. Come on, dude. I'm going to shift to the map. Went too far. Come on. There we go. Let me just get this up. Okay. So, this route leaves Elizabeth City, comes down to San Juan, Puerto Rico, comes down to Brazil, makes a couple of stops here along the Brazilian coast. And by this point, they're below the equator. Then they got to come all the way back up. They got to fly across the Atlantic to Morocco, Tunisia, and then across Libya, Egypt, and finally into Lake Baku and Russia. And that was an 11,000-mile run.
Okay.
But they were successful. They also began the delivery of 21 PBY-6As after the PBS were delivered in April of 1945. And if you remember, April 1945 is just about the end of the war.
Is it Rantis?
This is the PBY-6A. It, as you can see, has an improved gut position in the nose, and it's amphibious. The PBNs were not. They were only seaplanes. They did not have landing gear. But the 6As do, and they also had the next generation radar, which was mounted in a dome, which is not well defined in this photo, but it's right here over the cockpit. It had a higher frequency. It was even more, had a higher resolution. So, final deliveries and goodbye. 137 PBN-1s and 2 PBY-6As were delivered to the Soviet Navy with the loss of 2 aircraft. We'll only talk about one. I'm going to get to the second here in a minute. It was a final dinner celebration with Navy and Soviet officers in Elizabeth City on October 6, 44. Probably should be 45, I beg your pardon. And Lieutenant Sipasov got a silver cigarette box. The inside was a card with the signatures of all the U.S. Navy officers. It would remain with Chipasov's family, and it was forgotten until the daughter, Emilia, discovered it in a closet in 2005. Falls out of the closet, falls open, and she looks at it, sees these signatures. They say my dad and Maxim Chibisov say goodbye for the final time on 10/24 in Paris in 1945 with the final delivery of the PBY 6A Catalinas. Maxim Chibisov gave him a present. I'll show that to you in a minute. He presents his wings to my dad. They remain in the family. This is the group photo that was taken at Orly Airport in Paris. The final Soviet crew leaving from Moscow, because now, of course, they can fly right across Europe. And this is Commander Chibisov, was a tall guy. There in the middle.
In Holland.
This is the cigarette case with the names of the U.S. Navy officers that participated. Admiral Bellinger's signature is here at the top. There's my dad's. And these are the wings that Lieutenant Colonel Chibisov gave my dad on their final farewell. So, post-war events. So the Cold War starts right after the end of World War II. And both the U.S. and the Soviet government don't want to talk about a successful project or anything about cooperation together. So the project remains virtually under wraps by both countries. My dad is completely unable to maintain any contact with Chibisov. It might as well. Chibisov stayed in the Air Force, the Navy Air Force, and he went on to do additional work for the Air Force. It's detailed in the book. He actually was working on forward air bases in the Arctic, which is actually now a topic that's rearing its head again. But that was one of the projects he worked on. In 2005, after Amelia discovers the cigarette case with the American signatures, my dad goes to Moscow and he establishes contact with Elena, the two daughters, Elena and Amelia Chibisov, and meet them at a Lend-Lease museum in Moscow. That Lend-Lease museum is still there today. There's something else I was going to say about that. But that's how they knew of each other's existence. So, in April of 2009, and by the way, Commander Chibisov has already passed away. He passed away in 1989. Elena and Amelia arrived to visit my parents at their home in Chevy Chase, and they're also invited to celebrate the 64th anniversary of the Russian-American Army's meet at the Elbe River. And a memorial ceremony was conducted at that time at Arlington National Cemetery. And then the next day, my dad drives Amelia and Alina to see where their father worked, and he never told them. So they never knew. And showed them the base and the secrets it held. There was also a presentation made to the Coast Guard base leadership. They had no idea what happened to them. I mean, they changed. They rotate commanders out of there every 2 years or something. So there's no way to keep the continuity of knowledge there. Yep. So here's the gathering at Arlington National Cemetery. We have the Navy representation. We have Soviet representation right behind them. My dad, and this is Elena, and this is Amelia. This is the Soviet Honor Guard at the ceremony at Arlington. Russian now, not Soviet. This is my dad and Elena in front of the World War II Memorial on the Mall in Washington. They went there. Then they head down to Elizabeth City, and here are the photos of my dad giving a presentation not much unlike the one I'm giving you to people there on the base. And then finally, the photograph of my parents, the Coast Guard commanders, and Amelia and Elena together at the launch on the beach at the base. Full closure. So, in July 11th of 2020, there was a memorial organized at Elizabeth City. On January 11th, 1945, a PBN during takeoff, on a final night takeoff, crashed into the Pasquotank River. I had the original crash report, and it was an RAF officer that was flying the plane. It was cold that night. It was below freezing. And these planes that were leaving Russia were loaded to the gills with things. Bolts of cloth, alcohol, you name it. I'm going to back up a second and play a second video, which talks about this.
Well, they were very tight. They stuck to themselves. They had 2 KGB guys with them, sometimes 3. There was always somebody from the embassy around. So they watched their step very carefully. They are very strict, very disciplined rules. They were told not to fraternize with us anyway. There were 2 commanding officers. The first one, unfortunately, never made it back to Russia. He was the only plane we lost en route out of 125 that flew over. But in general, I got to know very well the second commanding officer that came about, Chibisov. The other chap that I worked with, Sadnikov, he was the only one of the group who knew anything about electronics. And one of the things I had to do is to translate all of the maintenance manuals into Russian. And there's certain terminology, I could speak Russian and so on, but certain technical terminologies that I just didn't know. So, and he did. So, and he didn't know the English. So, but between the 2 of us, I would sit down, make up an electronic diagram, and say, what do you call this thing? And he would give me the name. For instance, the word for frequency is chistota. And I worked almost daily with Sadnikov. So between the commanding officer, some of his staff, and Sadnikov, we got along fine. Yes, we did fraternize. We had drinks together at the clubs. We were happy to have them. But we could go to their rooms and quietly
So,
sipping rum and cokes and stuff. And
staff.
especially when the crews came back,
The voltage 10 like.
I mean, it'd fly
Yes, this,
about 5, 6 planes at a time to Russia,
We were happy for that.
or 10, and then it'd come back. And it'd come back by naval air transport eventually from Europe. Most of these people they were just happy to get back here. They made a lot of friends in the town of Elizabeth City because the merchants loved them. They were paid in dollars, and they spend these dollars like water. The planes going back were full of contraband, you might say, especially whiskey, things that were rationed in the United States. And you had to have coupons to buy shoes, for example. But yet they would be able to go and get shoes. Back in those days, Woolworth stores had bins with goods in them, like bins of socks, different sizes. Or they'd go in there and look at the socks and take a whole bin full of socks and pay for them. How much? And when the planes left the United States, they were fully loaded with merchandise. So there was very warm feeling between the local people and them in town. So a morning drive over and show the Russians how the United States got started. And so give a little twist to the history. Came sort of 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, kind of hungry. We went to the main lodge and had no problem getting seated. And the Colonel Chibisov and his crew, there were about 4 of them, and 2 of us, 6 of us were there. We had beautiful service, beautiful food, and they were very impressed by this whole thing. Impressed by the town, what they were seeing, how people live, how they made out, blacksmith shops and all that kind of stuff. Then we asked for the check, and the management came up and says, no, it's on us this time. And the Russians couldn't believe it. They just couldn't believe it that they were welcomed so well in the situation.
I'll make one comment about their the money. You heard him say, I heard my dad saying they were paid in American dollars. Well, these were just not any old American dollars. These were dollars that the Russians had hoarded prior to the revolution, because we weren't sending them any money after the revolution started. So these dollars were from before 1918. And these dollars were the ones that were originally backed by gold at Fort Knox. And on the top of the dollar, it said silver certificate. We, of course, are not on that anymore, but those were the dollars they had. They couldn't take them back to Russia. They weren't going to be any good there. So they would go into town and clean it out before they took off. So that's the story about dollars. So getting back to this, we had this crash and takeoff. We think the plane was partially overloaded. I also think the pilot might have momentarily suffered a loss of orientation because he was just off the water and he had the sensation he couldn't climb. And he pushed the stick forward and the plane went just straight into the river under full power. So the flight crew included 2 British, 1 Canadian, and 6 Russians. 2 British and 2 Canadian, or 2 British and 2 Russians survived. 5 bodies, though, 4 Russian and 1 Canadian, were recovered. So, but there is a commission, and I don't know if it's still active or not, but there is a commission between the Americans and the Russians to go and find any remains of Soviet and American soldiers wherever they may be around the world. So this commission asked to have a memorial ceremony in January 11th, 2020 for the remains of the Russians that are buried here. So this is the ceremony. We have the Russian honor guard. This is the Soviet ambassador and Tenali. And of course, the local Foreign Legion chapter there in Elizabeth City. And what they are doing is they're taking a wreath down to the blocking area in Elizabeth City. There was a ceremony, and then the wreath was placed in the water. And this was, just a few years ago. I was there. It was very moving. The group picture of the Soviet and American staffs. This is Elena Kretskova, and she is the Russian representative of the American-Russian TOWMIA Commission. So there's been some books now that have come out about the project since it got declassified. First in 2011, Elena and Amelia published the Russian version of this book back in 2011, based on their father's notes, flight logs, all of this information. And then in 2017, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Krisky, in collaboration with my dad, published another book on Project Zebra. And these two books actually complement each other. In 2021, I came along, picked up where my dad left off with a translation of Elena's original book. We updated it, Elena and I, after my father passed away. And I finally got it published in 2021, and those are the books that we have available here today. This book is from the perspective of Russia, and Commander Chibisov in particular. This book was written with a lot of input from the original files from Commander Chernek's family, all of his original records. So there's two perspectives here, and you get the American perspective and you get the Russian perspective. In Mr. Christie's book, there's a lot of anecdotes, a lot of additional stories that the Russians didn't get into. I'll give you one quick one. They decided to have a volleyball contest between the Americans and the Russians. The Russians show up, they bring a bouquet of roses. And the Navy guys say, "What's with the roses?" She says, that's for your funeral. Let's get up at that one, yes. And the Navy guys look at each other. They're all 6 feet. My dad's 6'1". And these Russians, they're short. You think, we're gonna kill them. See, 3 games later, after they'd lost all 3, they threw in the towel. So stuff like that will go on. So in modern times, these are the families today. This is Elena's, Chibisov's family. Here's Elena, her husband. This is her son, Maxim, after his grandfather, and kids, her daughter. And these are the kids. They're in Moscow. And this is Dad's children. Yours truly is on the far left. And then my wife, Martha, is here, and she's here with us today. And my brother Russell, and my sister Catherine, Russell's wife, and these are Russell's kids, Alyssa and Andy, and that's Andy's wife. Alyssa's now married too. So this is the memorial to Lieutenant Colonel Chibisov today in his hometown.
In Russian.
And that's the end. Be happy to entertain any questions. Yes.
What's the last tracks that happened in Northstown, Wildwood? Because it was a top secret project, what explanation, if any, intake care maybe to the families affected when they just hushed it?
Nothing. They just said, the families in Russia probably eventually informed, but they just said he died in the line of duty. We can't tell you where.
What about the one that was
The RAF, well, I doubt that they told anybody anything. This whole thing was just, I had my dad's flight. The flights he did out of Charleston with the conventional, normal, everyday squadron, they all had a stamp by the flight officer. When his flights begin in Project Zebra, there's no stamps, there's no nothing. It's just very cryptic entries. Yes.
How do you follow those projects? Spend that much time in West Carolina without going into town?
They went into town a lot.
Like crazy eyebrows. I mean, what is the?
Well, they came up to Philadelphia. They're flying these planes with red stars up and down the American coast. People aren't blind.
Right.
I will tell you that people during the war just learned not to ask questions. These planes got flown on the way to Alaska. They stopped in Texas. The Texans are all looking at it and saying, "What's this red star on the plane?" And the Navy guys just looked at him and said, "That's New York."
so but you know you will.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Did any of them read the diamond on him? And stone where she's smiling on what and it was a bit after kid of students that just about us in the ID 41. Because they were, and it was propaganda, the Russia to leave President Roosevelt around in their plan working in France. And it was in the circle all across the country. It's friendly, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Always in.
But no, I just want everybody to hear you. That was it.
Yeah, and her and Eleanor Roosevelt became friends, and they actually conversed with each other over the years. Did anybody by any chance read that book? Or like,
I have not heard that still.
yeah, it's but and as a truth, it's
Okay, yeah. As you know, the true stories are the ones really that to me are the most interesting.
Yeah.
There's more to this story, but I'm going to let you all read more of it.
One way.
Yes,
2016, your father did the interview.
about that year, yes.
95 years old at the time. Born in 19.
Close to it, 22. He was born in 22, so I haven't done the math in my head, but yeah, he lived to 2018.
Yeah, it strikes me. My father was born in 22, and
Oh, how long did he live?
92 years old.
Wow, yeah, okay.
I thought there was a Friday. It's gonna be a little so.
Yes.
I was just curious if you knew about like the loss rate when they were flying in the Soviet Union. Once all the PBMs were over there, did they lose a lot of their?
I honestly, we don't have any records. I know that a number of the PBYs lasted into the 1950s, but they used them hard. So I would not expect them to have lasted, later than that. But I think There was 157 total aircraft, and I think a number of them must have lasted, 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bill, we got you on here.
Did you? Yeah.
Next year. Later. And
Yeah.
what's the run?
Did you? Oh, I envy you. I would like to have done that. One other real quick story. Speaking of flying in one. When my dad got there to Elizabeth City, the first thing they had him do was fly with an American and Soviet pilot. They couldn't talk to each other, and one had to train the other. So my dad spent 2 weeks sitting on a cushion between the two pilots. And the American would say, all right, bank left. And Dad would translate to the Russian pilot. There weren't any headphones or intercom because there wasn't any for a middle position. So they're yelling at each other over the engines. And then that guy, once he was trained, the Russian instructor pilot, then they went and trained all the other instructors they had, trained the trainer. That's what it was. But that's how they had to start. It's tough.
You know, the BPYs are still in the museum in Montreal that we give.
They have models of the BBYs there in the museum. They do not have an actual plane. Yeah, we've got a few flying here today in this country, but no, I don't think Russia kept it. Especially since it was American. Yes.
Because of your families that other ES officers interaction with Soviet, when the Cold War broke out, would they, I don't know if you know this isn't called top free, but were they called upon again when like did he come or anything along those lines for the whole thing?
No, not directly. Okay. My dad did do seminars with the Department of Defense throughout his career on catastrophic events. I'll just leave it at that. There was something, though, you said that might be winner. Oh, there was one acknowledgement finally by the Russian government. It was in 1986, and it's in the books. No, 96. Yes, 96. The Russian government awarded a medal to my dad and to Commander Chonak for services rendered in support of the Great Patriotic War. And there was a ceremony at the Russian Embassy at Washington, D.C., and we all went down for that. That was really cool. And what I found out later was every morning on New Year's Day, our New Year's Day, not theirs, they would send a staff member from the embassy up to the house and give him a bottle of vodka every year. They never forgot. So, the rest just don't forget, they don't.